Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News and I'm the 106th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through its programming, including events like this, while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit www.press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you who are attending today's event. Our head table guests include guests of the speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause from our audience, we'd note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are featured on our member-produced weekly podcast from the National Press Club, available on iTunes. You can also follow the action on Twitter today using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have Q&A. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand up briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Maria Recio, Arts and Culture Correspondent for McClatchy Newspapers, David McCumber, Hearst Bureau Chief, Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief of Bankrate.com and a former National Press Club President, Diane Strahan, Chief Operating Officer of the Motion Picture Association of America and a guest of the speaker. Skipping over the podium, Donna Lindwan-Leger, a reporter for USA Today, Vice Chair of the Press Club Speakers Committee and a former National Press Club President. Skipping over the speaker for just a moment, Andrea Stone, a freelance writer and the Speakers Committee member who organized today's event. Thank you for that, Andrea. Nell Minow, a movie critic for BeliefNet. Linda Kramer-Jennings, Glamour Magazine's Washington Bureau Chief. Dipka Bombani with Hill & Knowlton Strategies. And Jonathan Salant, a reporter for Bloomberg News and a former National Press Club president. Our guest today, Christopher Dodd, spent 36 years on Capitol Hill and was Connecticut's longest-serving United States Senator when, in March of 2011, he went Hollywood, or at least to its outpost at 16th and I Street, where the offices of the Motion Picture Association of America, also known as Washington's most glamorous trade association, are located. As chairman and CEO of the MPAA, Senator Dodd is the leading advocate for America's movie and television industries. Despite making his red carpet debut at last year's Oscar Awards in Los Angeles, the former Senate Banking Committee chairman remains perhaps best known here as the Dodd in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, the most sweeping legislative reform in the financial services sector since the 1930s. Senator Dodd, whose father Thomas also served in the Senate, is perhaps most proud of his record on children's and families issues. He founded the Senate Children's Caucus and was the author of the 1993 Family and Medical Leave Act, which requires employers to give employees unpaid time off to care for a new baby or sick family member. Dodd would later become a staunch supporter of President Obama's health care reform bill. But in 2007, he was among the Democrats who also ran for president. He went so far as to move his wife, Jackie, and their 2 young daughters to Iowa a few months before those first-in-the-nation caucuses. Dodd immediately dropped out after his Senate colleague, Barack Obama, trounced him and the rest of the competition in Iowa. 2 years later, following accusations that he and other lawmakers received cut-rate loans from scandal-plagued subprime lender Countrywide Financial, a Senate ethics panel later cleared him of wrongdoing. And while facing a tough re-election campaign, Dodd announced in January of 2010 that he would retire. In August, while still in the Senate, he told the Connecticut Mirror that there would be no lobbying in his future. And although Dodd, often called Hollywood's top lobbyist now, even though federal law prohibited him from lobbying his former colleagues in Congress for 2 years, or until last month. Now, as the successor to legendary power broker Jack Valenti and more recently fellow Capitol Hill veteran Dan Glickman, Senator Dodd is the voice of the entertainment industry. As Dodd often notes, it is one of America's largest exporters, bringing, quote, more revenue back to the U.S. than agriculture, automobiles, and aerospace. As chairman of the MPAA, Dodd's top priority has been to fight the spread of online piracy and stop the illegal downloading and bootlegging of Hollywood's products. Not that it's been easy. In his first year on the job, Dodd was saddled with a public relations disaster when the 6 major motion picture studios that make up the association pushed for the passage of the Stop Online Piracy Act, or SOPA, the legislation that Hollywood viewed as safeguarding its copyrights and intellectual property rights came under heavy fire from Silicon Valley companies and internet users who said it would stifle free speech. The bill was eventually shelved. More recently, Dodd has taken heat from critics who link the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut to violent movies and video games. In a statement noting that the Sandy Hook School is in his home state of Connecticut, Dodd pledged that his industry would do its part to, quote, help America heal, saying, we stand ready to be part of the national conversation. Next weekend, however, everyone will be talking about the Academy Awards. Although before his marriage, Dodd was linked romantically to Bianca Yeager, and a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, dated Star Wars star Carrie Fisher. He only recently became a Hollywood insider himself. How so? By the time he left public service, Dodd had cast nearly 10,000 roll call votes in the Senate. Now, as a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, he gets to vote for the Oscars himself. Did he go for Lincoln, Argo, Zero Dark 30? As he said before last year's Oscars, when he refused to divulge his choice, I didn't spend 37 years in politics and not learn anything. Please join me in welcoming Senator Dodd.
So glad I came by for that introduction. Thank you. It's been a while, 2 years since I had that enjoyable experience of sitting here and hearing your life roll in front of you in a film version of an introduction. Well, I'm delighted to be back, and I thank the Press Club for inviting me to come by this afternoon and share some thoughts with you. So, Angela, I thank you very much. And I should point out what she didn't point out is this is Angela's first responsibility as her first job as host of these luncheons, and her job as the head of the Press Club. So a round of applause for her first job as our host of these events. Congratulations. I've been asked a lot over the last couple of years, and more recently, whether or not I missed the Congress. And I said, yes, but not this one, particularly, having watched what they've been going through over the last 2 years or so, the difficulties. And pointing out the presidential, the very short-lived. I'm glad you remembered it. Most Americans have long forgotten that I was a candidate, but it's nice of you to bring it up again today. Often thought I might actually have an address that had 1600 on it. Didn't realize it'd be 1600 I Street, and not sort of a block away from that other residence we thought about along the way that I thought of. And the 2-year ban you've mentioned as well, which is, I think, a very good law. There were times when January 3rd approached this year that I was hoping someone might offer an amendment to the fiscal cliff legislation to extend that ban a few more years, or at least give me an opportunity to pick and choose who I might have to see and talk to now that the ban has been lifted. Well, anyway, I thank you again for coming by. And I'd share some thoughts with you today. 2 years ago, if you had told me that I'd be standing before you and talking about the film and television industry, I might have been wondering what you were doing with your lives to assume that I'd be in this position. Like many of you, people enjoyed the films, enjoyed the movies over the years. As a father of 2 very young children, now 7, almost 8, and 11, my movie selections were somewhat limited. I think the last one I'd seen was the Heffalump movie with my children, so you don't get a chance to go out that often to see film. But I must tell you, in the last 2 years, I've become almost passionate about this subject matter and this industry. And so today I thought it might be worthwhile, as sort of a maiden speech, if you will, to share with you some thoughts that have developed over the last 23 months that I've been in this job, becoming what I call the Irish version of Jack Valenti. Jack held this job for 38 years, and then followed by Dan Glickman, my wonderful friend, who 6 or 7 years at the MPAA. I should point out as well, and you met Diane Strahan is here, our new COO, but there are a number of people here in the audience who have worked with the Motion Picture Association and in the business in this community over the years, and I'm very grateful to them. They've been tremendously helpful to me over these last 23 months and educating me about the industry and how important it is and what we can do to help advance its legitimacy in this country and elsewhere. So I thank them, and I notice there's some people from my previous life here as well, Angela, for my years in Congress, and I'm grateful to them for showing up today. So almost 2 years ago, as I began my job as the Chief Executive Officer of the Motion Picture Association of America, I was asked the following question by one of your colleagues here. The question was, why do movies matter? And I thought, well, that was a pretty good question. So today, in these brief remarks, 9 days before the 85th Academy Awards ceremony in Los Angeles, I'd like to try and answer that question. It was asked to me some 23 months ago. First of all, I'd like to share with you why I believe that movies matter as an art form. Unlike most other forms of art, motion pictures represent a spectacular convergence of visual arts, language arts, and music, attracting some of the world's most creative and talented people to produce these remarkable products. To state the obvious about most artists, they like an audience, and for many of them, the bigger, the better. That explains, in part, I would suggest, why some of the most extraordinarily creative talent in the world goes to Hollywood. After all, movies offer artists the opportunity to paint on one of the largest and most stimulating canvases ever created. Movies matter, too, because of the human emotions they excite. They entertain, they frighten, they comfort, they amuse, and they educate. The best motion pictures also elevate and enrich the cultural landscape of our nation. They dare us to think differently, and they make us walk often uncomfortably in another person's shoes. But most of all, movies tell stories. Stories that help us make sense of our world and of ourselves from time to time. This year's 9 Oscar nominees for Best Picture do all of this and more, I would suggest. Movies that stir the heart, Les Miserables, or Beasts of the Southern Wild, and Amour, for instance. Edge-of-your-seat films, like Life of Pi, Django Unchained. Gripping dramas, Silver Linings Playbook. And finally, 3 films that prominently feature policies or politics in their storyline, Lincoln, Argo, and Zero Dark 30, as a vehicle through which to raise awareness about important social and political issues. Movies matter culturally as well. This ability to not only entertain, but to stimulate, to provoke, to challenge, to educate, as I said a moment ago, has been at the heart of the creative film community since its birth more than 100 years ago. For decades, entertainment content creators have had the courage to cast their gaze on some of the most pressing social problems of their day. And once they did, their work profoundly impacted millions, I would argue, for the better, all across this country and around the world. Actors, directors, writers have constantly taken a leap of faith, putting themselves out on film for the world to see and scrutinize. Tom Hanks, who in the film Philadelphia dared Americans and the world to confront bigotry against people with AIDS. A Gentleman's Agreement, released in the late 1940s, cast an unflattering bright light, as it should have, on anti-Semitism. Or consider the impact, if you will, on racism in To Kill a Mockingbird, or Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. These films had on people here at home, as I said, and around the globe. The best movies ground us in common values and ideals. America's a big place, as we all know, with red states and blue states, as we're constantly reminded. We are a nation of conflict and division, a nation of competing interests, all which I would argue makes us healthier as a people. But gathered together in a darkened theater, regardless of our differences, we become in that shared experience one place. A place, for example, where 2 10-year-old children, one from a gritty West Texas ranch, the other from a 3-family flat in the Bronx, girls who might seem to have little or nothing in common, will go to their local cinema on a Saturday afternoon to see the same animated film, Brave, for instance, and walk out having absorbed the same vital lessons of courage, of love, of good character, and duty. We should remember that these movies that impact us so deeply, movies that unite us, are not just the products of well-known actors and directors, a Tom Hanks, a Sidney Poitier, or a Steven Spielberg. They are the result of incredible collaboration, often involving thousands and thousands of people. Those collaborations generate more than just social and cultural dividends, but economic ones as well, not only here but around the world as well. The movies create jobs, and many of them, all over the United States and elsewhere. So next week, when you join me and millions of others, Americans and the global audience, to watch the Oscars, and famous people walk the most famous red carpet in the world, keep this in mind, if you will. For every unfathomably rich and beautiful star you see that day, remember they represent less than 1% of the people responsible for creating these incredible products. The other 99% of the movie production workforce are men and women not unlike the people who erected this dais in which I speak today, installed the lights in this room, wired the very microphone I'm speaking from, or prepared our lunch today, for that matter. We're all guilty of viewing the film industry through the wrong end of the lens. Yes, talented actors, directors, writers, musicians are often the face of this film industry. But for every talented and recognizable face, there are literally tens of thousands of working people off-screen who help create the magic in the movie theater. Every workday, more than 2.1 million of our fellow citizens go to work at a job that either directly or indirectly depends on the movies and television business. These jobs involve producing, marketing, manufacturing, and distributing movies and TV shows and related movie and TV businesses. Nearly 700,000 direct jobs in all. Many of them are part of a network of 95,000 small businesses across the nation. And let me add, the film and television industry does more than simply create jobs. It creates careers. And many of these careers do not require a college degree or advanced education. With a high school diploma and several years of technical training, you're off and running in the movie and TV business, earning a good living, one that pays on average around $62,000 a year. And let me tell you something else that may surprise you. When you look at all those jobs that Hollywood is creating, avoid the temptation, as most do, to aim your telescope west toward Los Angeles or east towards New York. Aim it everywhere in this country, in the direction of every state in this nation, because the motion picture industry creates in all 50 states, including film hubs in Georgia, North Carolina, New Mexico, and New York, among others, even in small communities like Montagut, Louisiana, where Beasts of a Southern Wild was filmed. Over the past 2 years, more than 100 movies and 9 TV series were filmed in Louisiana. These productions created more than 8,500 jobs and paid out nearly $400 million in wages for both production and distribution-related labor. In 2011, 10 movies and 5 series were filmed in Pennsylvania, including the Oscar-nominated Silver Linings Playbook, creating more than 16,000 jobs and paying nearly $750 million in wages. Oscar-nominated Lincoln, filmed in Virginia in 2011, was one of 5 films and 1 TV series filmed in that state, creating 14,000 jobs and paying more than $640 million in wages in that state. And you can go down the list one after another across this nation and find one economic success story after another as a result of a film or television program produced in that jurisdiction. And the true impact of this American industry is realized far beyond the 50 states. Increasingly, movies matter on a global scale as well. It is our movies, and I would add television as well, that in many ways brand America in the eyes of the world. Right now, at this very moment, somewhere around the world, a young man or woman or a family is starting their exodus to America, excited to begin a new life in our country. There are many reasons why they'll make that journey or make that decision, as they have over the past 6 or 7 decades, to escape oppression, to make a better life for themselves, to chase their wildest dreams, unimaginable in the nation where they were born or raised. But I would wager that one of the reasons is because that man, that woman, or that family had seen American films, which convinced them that this country could be for them the land of unlimited possibility. This is just as true today as it was more than a century ago, when the motion picture industry in the United States began to flourish, not coincidentally, at the hands of immigrants who had come from Central and Eastern Europe to our nation. Last year was a great year for the film industry. At cinemas all over the world, movies reached the highest tally in box office history. According to Rentrack, international box office receipts outside of the United States and Canada weighed in at $23.1 billion. This is up nearly $1 billion compared to the previous year. And I'm taking the entire credit for that massive increase in their value system. It's all happened in the last 2 years, you'll notice. Here, make sure you call Hollywood and tell them that, will you, if you're reporting that. From Singapore to Berlin and Buenos Aires, in almost every market in the world, it was American films, the American movie, that audiences wanted to see. Our movies matter because they solidify the industry's standing as one of the premier American industries in the world. In 2011, the film and television industry had $14.2 billion in exports, an incredible 7-to-1 export-to-import ratio. No other major American industry has a balance of trade as positive in every nation on the globe in which it does business as the American film industry. And businesses is growing dramatically, especially in China, I would add, which is the big international story of 2012. Chinese box office receipts grew a staggering 31% to about $2.75 billion, making China the second largest international market outside of Japan. The total number of cinema screens in China today stands at about 11,000 and is expected to double by 2015. But consider this, every single day in China, 10 new screens are built and open up in that country every single day, beginning with IMAX theaters, 3D theaters, opening up that market to more and more people in that country. All of these factors add up to show the impact, I think, that the American movie industry has had on a global scale as well. But in the final analysis, both here and abroad, the industry is so successful because it represents an extraordinary value to consumers the world over. 2 weeks ago, I was in Los Angeles for the 65th Annual Directors Guild of America Awards. One of the pre-awards events was a discussion with the 5 directors who had been nominated by the Directors Guild as Best Director Award, about the craft of filmmaking. That was the subject of the panel conversation. On that panel was the Lincoln director Steven Spielberg, Life of Pi director Ang Lee, Zero Dark Thirty's Catherine Bigelow, Argo's Ben Affleck, and Tom Hooper, the director of Les Miserables. When I listened to those remarkable artists and the incredible collaboration they had orchestrated to make these enduring masterpieces, I realized that this iconic American film industry is like no other on the planet. In a very real sense, every movie the film industry creates is handcrafted and utterly unique, each and every one. The product is made with the creative equivalent of the finest gourmet ingredients available: writers, actors, directors, film scores, technical supporters, and the list goes on, all brought together to produce this unique, utterly unique product. It would be ludicrous, of course, to suggest that every film that Hollywood creates is of enduring value. I'm not suggesting that. But I would suggest that this year's lineup is particularly excellent. Film and television content are very expensive to produce. It's not uncommon for a film to take 2 years or more and tens of millions of dollars to make, a product that dozens and dozens of people toiled over to making every second matter in that film. And increasingly, they are incorporating major technological breakthroughs in their work, especially in IMAX and 3D, which is revolutionizing the theater-going experience. Take Life of Pi, for example. The novel Life of Pi was published in 2001. Ang Lee read it, was riveted, and wanted to make the movie. But there was one catch. Creating scenes of a boy and a live man-eating Bengal tiger on a lifeboat would be awkward, to say the least, in that production. He knew technology would be the answer. But 12 years ago, technology had not yet caught up with his vision. Last year, it did. Thanks to the production team that pushed themselves to deliver something that had never been done before, a marvelous movie was created. This is yet another example of why we go to the movies, to be astonished and to dream as well. Yet with all of this technology, innovation, and creativity, the ticket price to consumers has remained remarkably stable over many, many years, roughly $8. Other than staying at home, listening to music, or watching free TV programming, the most affordable, accessible form of entertainment in the world, in my view, is still watching a motion picture inside a state-of-the-art theater. That is why in the United States and around the world, I'm told that movie theaters continue to draw more people than all theme parks and major sporting events combined. It has never been a better time to be a consumer of movies and television. Because movies matter to more people in more places who want to watch them at more times across multiple platforms, the film and television industry is continuously innovating to meet that demand. Today, movies and television shows can be viewed in theaters on big screens or at home on TV screens, laptops, iPads, Kindles, and smartphones. There are more than 375 unique, licensed online distribution services around the world that provide high-quality, on-demand film and television shows, offering the easiest, fastest, safest, highest quality product and viewing experience possible. These services cater to every manner of consumer viewing model, including rental viewing, download to own, subscription viewing, and ad-supported viewing as well. These distribution services are provided by every conceivable type of commercial entity, including technology companies, broadcast television networks, pay channels, internet providers, movie retailers, and content renters like Amazon, Netflix, iTunes, and Vudu. So the next time someone suggests that the film and television industry is not innovating fast enough to satisfy consumer demand, you might remind them of these innovations which I've just shared with you. To paraphrase Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, pictures may be getting smaller on some screens, but movies are still big and about to get even bigger. Increasingly, the movies industry's creative talents, including its actors and directors, are creating feature content for television and online audiences as well. The cable stations, even smaller ones, are getting in on the action. Content providers such as Hulu just announced it will produce an original program called Battleground. Amazon.com will develop television pilots and feature films. And Netflix has invested $100 million to produce exclusively for its subscribers a remake of the classical BBC series House of Cards. These innovations are great for consumers. I'm not exaggerating when I say that a new golden age in television and film is being ushered in. You can watch more content than ever through more channels, and the quality of the movies and television shows is outstanding and getting better every day. That is why it's so crucial, in my view, that we protect this content from theft. Because consumers deserve, more than any other reason, consumers deserve to enjoy first-generation versions of their favorite films, not secondhand, pirated films of films shot and recorded inside a movie theater on a mobile phone. We must strike a balance, in my view, between the desire for a free and open internet, which I strongly support, and the protection of intellectual property. The future cannot be about choosing one over the other, between protecting free speech or protecting intellectual property. It should and must be about protecting both. We can and must, in my view, have an internet that works for everyone, and we can and must have protection for the creative industry's genius that intellectual property represents. There should be no confusion, in my view. For more than 2 million Americans whose jobs depend on the motion picture and television industry, free and open cannot be synonymous with working for free. To protect intellectual property and the openness and freedom of the internet, we must work together to innovate our way through these challenges. Fortunately, Silicon Valley and Hollywood are making some progress on this front, and I applaud them for doing so. So to answer the question put to me almost 2 years ago, next month, why do movies matter? They matter because of the enormous contribution they make, as I said, to the creative art form. Movies matter because they elevate and enrich the cultural landscape of our country. Movies position America favorably, in my view, on a global stage, both politically and economically. And either directly or indirectly, the film industry puts food on the table of more than 2 million of our fellow citizens. The movies deliver extraordinary value to consumers, from their affordable price point to their delivery across multiple platforms. But most of all, movies matter because they educate and inspire. They have the power to change people's minds and even their lives. Films like To Kill a Mockingbird and Deer Hunter and Platoon had a profound impact on me as a human being, and I'll never forget them at all. And if I asked each and every one of you here today to point out or suggest whether or not there was a film that changed your lives, I suggest that every one of you could answer the question with a film that motivated you or changed you in many ways. And so, at the moment you did answer that question, I would tell you that you just proved my point and answered the question that I was asked more than 2 years, almost 2 years ago. Movies do matter. And I thank you for listening this afternoon. Thank you, Don. You want me to stand here?
Yeah.
Having a Marco Rubio moment. Couldn't resist it.
Well, thank you,
Right.
Senator. We have a wide variety of questions, so I hope you're ready to cover
Wide variety.
cover the landscape. Starting off with, of course, topic important to right now in Washington and the country, violence, gun violence. The president, of course, in his State of the Union last week, made an impassioned appeal to reduce gun violence. What about reducing the amount of violence in movies? And is there a desensitization to it from there being so much shooting on the screen?
Well, it's a great question. And as you pointed out in your introduction of your remarks, one of the very first things we did, first of all, let me begin these remarks, as we're gathered here, a few blocks away at the White House, the president was giving out this morning Citizens Awards to a number of people. I know Harris Warford was one of them, and Dr. Brazelton, who I've worked very closely with. You mentioned my involvement in children's issues, and Barry Brazelton and I spent 30 years together working on everything from autism and child care and family medical leave, so I was very honored, and Harris Warford was one of the authors and founders of the Peace Corps, which I served in back in the 60s. But there were 6 other people also honored, and these were the people in Newtown, Connecticut, who courageously saved maybe some additional lives and otherwise would have been lost. I represented Newtown for 30 years. It's more than an abstraction to me. I happened to have driven through the community the night before, December 14th, on my way to Waterbury, Connecticut. So I even have a hard time talking about it, even at this date, and will, I presume, the rest of my life. So I care about it deeply, and as you pointed out, I spent 36 years, 30 of them in the Senate, working on issues, on children's issues. So I care deeply about the subject matter. And I felt it was important, and we'd said at the very outset, supporting the administration's efforts, the Vice President's task force to look at these questions, and said we wanted to be part of that conversation. And we have been, in many ways. It was almost 50 years ago that Jack Valenti voluntarily, without executive order, regulation, or passage of a law in Congress, established the rating system back in the 1960s to provide tools for parents to make better choices about what their children might see, what they wanted to see. And over the years, that system has evolved tremendously from what it was in the late 1960s, to the point today there are more descriptors involved and so forth. A lot of technology has changed. In the 1960s, there were movie theaters and 3 networks. And of course, today, as I mentioned already, the amount of platforms that have emerged in technology, providing so many more places where entertainment, visual entertainment, can be seen. And so we're working to try and provide whatever assistance and support we can in that effort. And we'll be a part of that in the coming weeks. We already are a part of it. So again, I think it's an important issue, and we're going to be working with the administration and others to find out if there are ways that we can be supportive and helpful. Let me tell you where I think the space is for us. I feel very strongly that this country, this industry has been in the forefront of freedom of speech from its inception. As I mentioned, films that have challenged and provoked not always were received warmly, because today we look back on them with maybe more favorable eyes than when they were released at the time they were. But we have an obligation. We found, and I sort of look at it in 3 ways. One, we provide choice for people, and remarkable choice for entertainment. Not every movie is for everyone. We believe very strongly in control. That is, giving parents the tools they ought to have to make the decisions they want. What comes into their home? When that child is going out of their home, what are they going to see? What can you learn about is available to them? And thirdly, to educate as well as you can so that people are aware of what those tools are and how they can access them in the modern technology, including websites and so forth that exist. So that choice, control, and education are really the 3 legs. And that second piece of control is really where we feel very strongly that we need to do as much as we can to provide those kinds of tools and give people the kind of choices that they want to have. And that's where we're going to work in that space.
What is your opinion on the amount of violence in movies? Is there too much? And if so, should Hollywood do something to
again,
produce
that's,
less?
the audiences are very varied in our country. We try to produce, as I say, product and give people choices across a spectrum. And that people ought to be able to have the information about what they're going to see when they walk in so they can make that choice whether or not they want to pay that price and go to that theater experience. And I think you start getting to the business here of trying to regulate content, and that's a very slippery slope in my view. And you've got to be very careful about that. There's a temptation, I think, to do that, but I think the best space to be in is giving people the information they need to make the right choices for themselves, particularly parents, so that they can have the ability to control what comes into their own homes and better information about what exists when their children go out the door.
You mentioned the Biden task force. Have you had a chance to talk yet with President Obama himself on the gun issue? And if so, what have you told him?
No, I haven't had that.
Do you plan to, and what will you tell him?
Well, I think normally the calls come from him to me. I mean, I'd be delighted to talk to him about it, but he got a lot on his mind.
Is it fair for the NRA and its allies to try to paint video games and Hollywood films as an environmental factor in mass shootings?
Well, it's sort of predictable in a way. If you go back over the years, I mean, there were people who suggested that comic books were the reason for people doing things before any of this existed. So there's been if you go back and look at the history, every time so many of these things happen, there's kind of a lurching from time to time to suggest that this is the root cause of the problems. But let me take advantage of your question for 1 minute and suggest something, and that is, I know there's a lot of this debate that goes on, and I grew up around it in no small measure. You mentioned my father in your introduction was very involved in these issues. And Connecticut is now the 7th largest producer of guns. We were #1 in the country for many years with Colt and Winchester and the like. But if you were to ask me where I think we need to be focusing a lot of our attention, it is in the mental health space. I managed on the floor of the United States Senate the mental health parity legislation. People like Paul Wellstone, Pete Domenici, Ted Kennedy, many others, Gordon Smith, who now runs the National Association of Broadcasters, having lost a son, took his own life, we're also deeply involved in this. But I happen to have been chairing the committee and managing the bill on the floor of the Senate. My hope is that with while there's much more pyrotechnics around about guns and about media, my hope is, while it may not produce the kind of results immediately you'd like that a bill can in Congress, the mental health space really, if we don't do anything else, to finally put some meaningful resources into this scourge of mental health. I don't know how many of you read the blog by that woman who announced that she was the mother of, in effect, a child that was very much like this young man that took the lives of the children in Newtown. And there's a lot of anxiety out there and not many opportunities for people to access the mental health they need, that families need. I used to say to audiences when I was in Congress from Connecticut, is there anyone in this audience, and I'll ask this one, is there anyone in this audience who hasn't been touched by this issue, either at home, with people you work with, the people you're close to, a mental health issue? I've never met an audience yet where a single hand was ever raised. Everybody understands this issue and how devastating it can be. And if I could pray for any one thing today with your question, is that's the space we really need attention, in my opinion. Yeah.
So a bunch of questions about Zero Dark 30. I'll choose this one. What do you make of the controversy over Zero Dark 30, particularly the lawmakers who have criticized that film for its depiction of torture?
Well, I had the opportunity to introduce Catherine Bigelow here at the museum when it screened the film Zero Dark 30. And I'll begin with what I said to that audience. First of all, it's a movie. It's a movie. So you need to understand what that means. There's a lot of poetic license in the creation of artistic art form. And this was not a documentary. Obviously, it's about real-life events that happened. And my view is that they wanted to tell this story of what transpired over a decade that ultimately led to the successful apprehension and the killing of Osama bin Laden. Part of that story involved enhanced interrogation techniques, and you saw them on the film. I almost suggested had you tried to tell that 10-year story and left it out, there might have been even a greater criticism of the film for disregarding something that was used. I think it was also clear as I saw it, and I've watched it a couple of times, the film. In my view, I thought the film said that ultimately the reason that we were able to find out who the courier was for a lot of reasons. Some of it was purely accidental, as the film points out. Some of it was because they were incredible Americans whose names none of us are ever going to know, who get up every morning and go to work to keep us safe, that are staring at computer screens, drilling for data that give us information that keep us safer. We don't always celebrate Washington, That film celebrates, in my view, the incredible, incredible hard work that gets done by people whose names and faces we'll never, ever know. So put aside whether or not you think it was a good movie or a bad movie. I'll leave that for the critics and the voters at the Oscars. But if you ask me whether or not Catherine Bigelow tried to make a good movie and tell a story and also celebrate the lives of some remarkable people, I think she achieved that goal. Yeah.
You mentioned the movie rating system, and this questioner asked, since you're here at the National Press Club, a place dedicated to transparency, could you address the secrecy surrounding the film rating process? And would you favor bringing that process into the open, including more transparency about who the people are making ratings decisions and how those determinations are made?
Well, look, again, it's nothing static about it. I mean, as I mentioned, it started back in the 1960s, and it actually goes even further back. I'm not going to engage in a history lesson, but the first head of the MPA was a fellow by the name of Hayes, and then it moved to Eric Johnson, who had a second job, and then it was Jack for many years, and Dan Glickman, I mentioned, and myself. And this was an effort to get away from, which occurred, where you had literally jurisdictions had their own ratings boards. And so you can imagine trying to produce a product that had a national audience, tailoring it to various markets around the country. You'd kill an industry. And so the idea was to come up with a national rating system, a voluntary system, to try and provide that guidance for people along the way. And obviously, it goes back to the Hayes rules, and they seem almost comical today, I suppose, for what they were in the 1920s coming along, as opposed to what we accept today as a 21st century audience. So there's nothing in concrete about this. You try to make judgments based on where public mood and attitude and sensibilities are as you move forward. And that's what the ratings board has tried to do over the years and still does. I'm on the appeals board of it, so they meet occasionally when producers or directors will appeal a rating along the way. So we're constantly examining, are we doing this as well as you can? The things that you can do better. You're never going to have it perfectly well. You're dealing with a very diverse audience. Forget whether or not an international audience. You're dealing with a domestic audience that has very different ideas of what is acceptable or unacceptable. So in that space, to try and come up with the best you can so that people have as much information as they can to make the decisions I mentioned earlier. We've stayed away from advertising who people are because you can imagine what that would provoke and invite in this day and age. These are people who come from what we call families across the country, so they try to represent geographically the kinds of views that might be represented in various areas of our nation, where there may be some differences. Economic background, so they're not coming from one particular sector or another. You never have that perfectly right either. But when we've asked over the years, the American public, through surveys done, how are they doing? Most recently, a couple of years ago, before all of the most recent incidences occurred, and again, it may change somewhat in light of what's happened now in Newtown or what happened in Aurora. I can't tell you that. I haven't seen anything lately. But as of a year or so ago, putting aside the specifics, when asked the question, what do you feel about the rating system? The answers, the numbers were very, very high, above 70%, as I recall, people having a favorable response about their use of the rating system to make decisions. So I think it does a pretty good job in a very difficult space to try and represent the values and ideals of a people as diverse as we are.
You talked a good deal about the Chinese market and how it's expanding. Is the MPAA working with the Chinese government to open that market to allow for the release of additional American films, and especially non-censored American films?
Well, sure. I mean, I mentioned for many years the limits were, and not just us, it was global. The only 20 foreign films, including our own, could be screened in the Chinese market. And then as a result of a WTO case, World Trade Organization case, and a negotiation of which the MPAA and the U.S. Trade Office did a terrific job, we were able to increase that number from 20 to 34 of the films. There are no limitations on co-production, but obviously China decides what it's going to allow its viewing public to see. And so they do control that, and that's no great surprise, not just us, but others, and they have their own standards of what they use or accept that will be allowed to be shown in their theaters. I mentioned in my remarks that what has happened that's been interesting is despite the size of the country, there were very few theaters in China. But recently, the Chinese have decided this is something they want to provide for their consumers, and are building and opening up 10 new screens a day in the country, to the point where they have about 11,000 today, but even a few years ago, it was just a handful. So we're on a fairly good space and working at it all the time, going back and forth. And again, there's always some issues that come up, but we think it's an opportunity, again, for as much as it has been. And I say this in somewhat of a parochial sense, but again, I think our country has benefited tremendously over the years because of an American film industry. It doesn't mean every film we're necessarily proud of. I'll just tell you one quick anecdote that sort of makes the point, maybe. I was attending one of these film festivals, actually, in Australia, my first trip to that country, and an individual came up and talked to me, who was in the business, I guess, but he started out by saying, I'm paraphrasing, you know, I have a strong disagreement with your country and your foreign policy. Went on at some length, as we're not unfamiliar with. You kind of hear that wherever you go to some degree in certain places. But he stopped me and said, but I want to say one thing. He said, about your film industry. He said, I know of very few other nations in the world that not only tolerate having an industry examine, ridicule, attack, challenge public and private institutions, as you do in the United States. And then to top it all off, you turn around and give them awards for doing it. He said, as much as I get upset with some of your policies, no other nation in the world celebrates the freedom of speech and the welcoming of ideas. We had a night the other night for George Stevens, who many of you know, George Stevens Jr., a wonderful family with a rich tradition in this industry. He now spent most of his adult life here in Washington. But I remember as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1960s when George Stevens was the head of the film and television division of USIA under Edward R. Murrow in those days in the Kennedy years. And they produced 300 documentaries a year. And I remember as a Peace Corps volunteer way up in the mountain villages on the border with Haiti, getting some of those documentaries with a generator, because there was no electricity, putting up a sheet, in some cases, to screen one of George Stevens's documentaries. And many of them were not flattering about us. Many of them were, I remember showing the film about the Nine in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the civil rights thing. But I remember watching the audience in that remote village, if you will, all of a sudden getting an appreciation. We weren't afraid to talk about ourselves and to talk about how we're all trying to get this better in each generation, moving us along. And we do that, not necessarily with USIA today, but Catherine Bigelow, you know, what was done with Argo, what's done with Lincoln, going back and telling in a way that probably more people know about the 13th Amendment today and the abolition of slavery as a result of that film, with all due respect to history teachers the world over, in a sense. It is a remarkable contribution for our country. And the idea that we can show and demonstrate who we are in a place like China, I think ought to be welcomed. And so we're going to continue pushing to try and get more of our product in, because we believe that they deserve to see what we're making as well. And we think it's good for us, too, to be able to have that opportunity.
The MPAA has backed extending copyrights for works that were created decades ago. The questioner asks, what possible public good could come of extending such copyright? Isn't this a huge giveaway to the studios and publishers?
Read that again. What is it?
Questions about extending copyrights for old movies.
Well, the only specific law that was written into the Constitution of the United States in 1789 was copyright, with all the other broad values that are incorporated in that organic document. The only specific recommendation was copyright. And there was long before, obviously, film or television in 1789. But we were a young country, and we realized that we needed to protect our innovations and our creativity. And it's unfortunate the way this debate seems to come down, and your introduction sort of reflected it as well. This is all about Hollywood and technology, and suggesting that copyright and counterfeit goods and security issues are not included in this debate and discussion. I'll repeat what I said earlier. To me, I think what's occurred technologically is so incredible, and how much we've benefited and the world has with having a free and open and internet that works for everyone. It is exciting beyond words that it exists. I also happen to believe that the innovations, the creativity that are able to be produced here and elsewhere are also very much worth protecting and preserving. The issue becomes, can these two worlds exist together? And I believe they not only can, but must, if we're going to succeed. I spent the day last week at Pixar, in the Bay Area in Los Angeles, now a division of the Walt Disney Company. If you ever get the chance, they have tours you can go through if you're out there. Go and look at it. You're looking at what the world ought to look like. It is content and technology, producing masterful works in the animated space. Really phenomenal what they achieve and accomplish. Someday someone's going to write the book, as I like to tease people in California, that there was the global capital of content in one city. And a car ride away was the global capital of technology. And for some reason, in the same country, in the same state, these people couldn't figure out how they needed each other. And we're asking all of us to somehow make a choice. Pick one side or the other, as if in the end, we're all going to benefit if one loses and one wins. Content needs technology. Technology needs content. And I'm working as hard as I can to find ways in which we can bridge this gap. And a lot is happening, and positive news. We're working with Google, for instance, and stepping up on sort of depressing, if you will, on the first pages, illegal sites. We're working with the ad brokers. We're working with the payment processors to try and make sure we strip the financial advantages out of illegal sites as well. We're going to have a site opened up in the next few weeks that will give people a chance to learn if, in fact, unintentionally they've been downloading illegal a product without any punitive implications. Working on the assumption that most people, if informed that there's something they're doing is outside of the legal space, it'll stop, or they'll stop doing it. So there's any number of things that are occurring in that area. You haven't asked the question, but I'm not enthusiastic about legislating in this area. I think we need to try and find ways in which we can achieve what ought to make sense to everyone, and stop asking people to somehow pick one side of this equation or the other, as if somehow we're going to win if that occurs, somehow as if it were an athletic contest, rather than recognizing we need both content and technology for the benefit of everyone, in my view.
Well, speaking of legislation, privacy legislation, of course, was derailed last year because of opposition from high-tech companies in part. Are you talking with those companies, that industry, to work out a compromise in this new Congress? And what concessions are you willing to make to get that sort of bill through?
Well, there's a lot of conversation occurring, and occurring not just at this level. Most of it's been occurring business to business, I would suggest, without going into the details. One, I don't know all the details of it. Not necessarily should I necessarily know them. I just know that the content companies work. In fact, most of them, I think, have distribution agreements, for instance, with Google already, so they have business-to-business relationships every single day at many levels, and a lot of communication. A lot of the technology companies now moving into content themselves, which will, I think, probably raise the profile of content as you're beginning to try and market it. I presume you're going to want to get compensated for your creations as well. So a lot is occurring that I think is moving us in the right direction. In ways. And I'm certainly reaching out, and will be, to people to try and figure out there's some ideas people can bring to the table on how we can see that space be filled by those who want to see content and technology. And of course, technology is changing at warp speed. I mentioned in my remarks all of the incredible things that are occurring in the content space technologically. This idea it's old media. It's anything but old media. If you see how it's being produced and what's occurring today, it's phenomenal what's occurring in the content space. And so it's sort of ludicrous to be talking about as old media, in a sense. And so to the extent we can do that, I think we're all going to be benefiting. And it will require, I think, constant work. There's not some point at which it's all over with. I think it requires the kind of cooperative relationship that is going to produce the best results, in my view. And we need some people who are willing to understand that and step up and make it happen. I think Steve Jobs clearly did, in a way. I think Bob Iger at Disney, who's on the board of Apple, certainly does. You can go down the list of various other people. The founder of eBay, who is also in the content side of the equation. There are a lot of those people who move back and forth and have been successful in both technology and content. And I think leadership from those elements, obviously Steve is gone today, but nonetheless, the example I cited with Pixar is a good example. Lucasfilms is a wonderful example, again, that just acquired, by the way, by Disney as well, but that idea of having that incredible technology at the Presidio in San Francisco is an example, again, of content and technology, state-of-the-art stuff that's producing incredible product for all of us. Yeah.
We'll move to a couple of questions about your previous life, before your current job. Questioner asks...
Which previous life are you going to talk about?
The one in the Senate.
Just curious that I looked at
In light of the Senate's refusal to bring Chuck Hagel's nomination as Defense Secretary to a vote this week, do you think that Harry Reid made a mistake by not forcing through a real reform of the filibuster?
Well, look, I want you to get back to some of the questions about the space I'm in. After 36 years, I loved my job in Washington. I'm a great observer. I read all the press accounts and get the magazines and so forth to keep up with it, but I'm not there. And they've got a tough job, and my former colleagues. And by the way, I am optimistic. I know this is a minority view. I'm optimistic about the Congress. A remarkable generation coming along, Republicans and Democrats, in my view, who are going to once again make that institution as important and as vibrant and vital as it has been historically. And so I'm sort of alone in expressing that view, but I believe it very strongly. And I can get down a list of people who I have great confidence in and hope in that I think are going to make a difference in all of this. I happen to be an advocate of if the simple question is, do you believe there ought to be a filibuster rule in the Senate? Of course there should be, in my view. It's what the founders intended. If you're creating nothing more than a sort of a unicameral system, de facto, a mirror image of each other, then what's the point, in a sense, of having two chambers? There is a reason why the Senate is a counterbalance, why the House is the counterbalance, where the popularly elected official, where the majority rules. And the Senate was to be a place where the minority rules, in a sense, that the rules tilt to favor the minority, a minority of one, including that the founders had in mind. In a sense, it seems almost antiquated in the world where all of us want things yesterday. You mentioned the question, or someone did to me earlier, about the new, what they call, some of the headline was binging, where instead of waiting 13 weeks to watch a serial of a TV show, you can now watch all 13 episodes on one weekend. I can't, well, anyway, people want to do this. But the idea, we all want everything immediately. The idea of some patience in a process. In the Senate, inherent in the Senate, is slow and patient, and for good reason. There's nothing wrong with the rule of the majority, but we've all learned painfully, historically, that there can be a tyranny to the majority, and some additional thought may be required to make sure what we're going to do is the right thing to be done. And so the Senate, that ability to be able to slow that down is important. Now, if you abuse the privilege of doing so, then the pendulum swings the other way. And it has, in my view, and it's been abused to the point where you end up with people talking about getting rid of it altogether. And so if you're going to use it deliberately when you think it ought to be used. But you know, don't use it as often as I've seen it used in the last few years, or you do run the risk of losing it altogether. But I would vehemently oppose any effort to undermine that even further than has been the case.
We are almost out of time, but before asking the last question, we have a couple housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you about our upcoming luncheon speakers. On March 13th, we have Mariska Hargitay, star of Law and Order SVU and founder of the Joyful Heart Foundation. She will discuss her career and how her role inspired her to become an advocate for survivors of violence and abuse. On April 9th, we have Dr. John H. Noseworthy, the president and CEO of the Mayo Clinic, who will discuss issues facing the healthcare industry. And on April 12th, we have documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, who will discuss his new documentary, The Central Park Five. Second, I would like to present our guest with the traditional National Press Club coffee mug.
Yep.
You can add it to the collection.
This year I can accept it and take it, too.
Pretty sure it's below the gift limit. One last question.
Well, that's always dangerous. This is the one you want to duck.
We have a mystery we're hoping you can explain from your time now in this job and the previous one. Can you help us understand why whenever a celebrity shows up on Capitol Hill to push a favorite cause, there is so much excitement in the halls of Congress?
Nope. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for coming today. Thank you for not dodging the hard questions, at least. I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff, including its Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. Finally, here's a reminder that you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of today's program, please check out our website at www.press.org. Thank you. We are adjourned.